Hey everyone, my name is Christine, and I'm one of the computerized educators for Gimmel. And I thought I'd take a little bit of time today to show you just a little bit about how I use the apply function in Creative Studio to address some of those hard to figure out a pattern for kind of places on some of these quilts. Typically, what I end up getting are a lot of modern quilts. And a lot of modern quilts have a lot of, shall we say, unique features. And sometimes that involves shapes that you don't typically see on a quilt. And it's sometimes hard to find the right pattern that's going to fit in that space. And so I'm just going to take a little bit of time today to go ahead and walk you through how I addressed this quilt that I have on my screen now. This is a quilt that I got from a good friend of mine in the UK. Her name is Sarah Hibbert, and we've worked back and forth together quite a few times. But what I wanted to talk to you today is about addressing some of these big blue areas that we have on this quilt, these big arching curved sections. And I don't know about you, but it's hard to find patterns that would fit an area like that. So a lot of times, especially on these modern quilts, I have to go out of my way to create a new pattern for those spaces. So I figured today I would just take a little bit of time to walk you through how I use the apply feature to create patterns that fit areas specifically like this blue one that we see here. So if you'll notice, most of this quilt, it's about the background quilting. So the area that's in this blue, it's on a very dark fabric, so you're not going to see a lot of the quilting that I do on it. But I just wanted something very simple that would allow that fabric to shine and allow us to focus on more of the background. I'll take, this is another picture real quick when it was still on my frame. So you can see we're going to create kind of this little rainbow effect in the background. So that's what I'm going to go over today is show you exactly how I created that pattern to fit that area. So now let's go take a quick look. I've shown you the completed quilt, and this is kind of an in progress shot of what I was doing. Let's go take a look at the completed quilting for this quilt. So this is all of the quilting that I did on this quilt. A lot of the background stitching. But what we're going to focus on right now is this area in, let's see if I can select it. So it's going to be in this highlighted area, right? This upper crescent kind of shape. And we're going to use that apply feature along with one of the patterns that I have on my screen, this deep V pattern. It's very simple to create in order to create a distinct, unique pattern to fit exactly that shape. So if you notice over here, I went and I stitched in the ditch around that blue area, and I did that with draw arc, right? So I came up here to draw arc, and while I was there, I went and clicked around this whole entire arc shape across the straight parts and around all the sides. So that gave me a basis after I stitched that out in Creative Studio to give me that shape represented in Creative Studio. So we're going to use that to then go ahead and create that custom pattern. So I'm going to start here with, this is that shape that I went and stitched in the ditch around. But to create that intersection, I want to echo in from the edge, right? So if you see here, I left a little space. So that's about a 1/2 inch echo inside. So let's go ahead and get our echo inside. So I'm going to grab that first section. So I'm going to come over here and say echo. And we don't need an echo. Let me see if I can get it to go on the inside. Hold on. There we go. There's our echo on the inside. So very simple. Get our echo on the inside so that we have that echo. I would go ahead and stitch that out. So right now I'm just going to go ahead and toggle that pattern sewn. So in theory, if I was stitching this out right now, this would be my ditched line that I stitched, used my draw arc to stitch around with. This next pattern is the echo that I would go ahead and stitch. And now to create a pattern to fill this main area here, we're going to use this deep V pattern with apply to fill the center. So what I'm going to do in order to get a pattern to use with apply on the screen, I'm actually going to divide off part of our echo. So that means I need to go ahead and go into nodes. And you'll notice with our echo, we have a lot of pink nodes. So echoes will always come up in all pink nodes in that polyline, right? And they won't give us any blue nodes, and that's okay. So I'm going to grab this corner here and hit divide. And that gives us most of that shape. We need to get this section down here. So I'm just going to go ahead and divide off the last part of that section. Right? Okay. So right now, in order to get that off of my screen, I'm just going to go ahead and convert that pattern to a boundary real quick, just so it doesn't interfere with anything else that I'm doing right now. But I still want to keep it so I can go ahead and manipulate it later. So I'm just going to take that portion of that echo pattern to a boundary. And then I want to grab this first segment, not that one of our echo pattern. And then we're going to take that echo pattern and I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to do an order join real quick just to make sure that those are all connected and going in the right order and direction. We can also check that with our set sew order, right? It is going in the direction I want. So I'm just going to do my order join real quick, and it just gives me that inner echo. So I'm going to go ahead and just combine those patterns. So this is the pattern that we're going to want to use on the screen with apply. And then we're going to have to make sure that the height of this pattern is the right height so that it fills this space. So in order to make sure we know how to size the pattern appropriately for using apply, I'm going to come up and use our measuring tape feature real quick. I'm going to grab my measuring tape feature and I'm just going to measure out kind of a rough estimate, right? So top to bottom, it's just over 4 inches, right? So I probably want to make sure that my pattern is at least 4, probably more like 4 1/4. But see down here, the width of that pattern is really only about 2 1/3. So just be aware that we're fitting a pattern into a differently shaped space. So now I want to come in and before we use apply, we want to check the height of the pattern that we're going to use to apply. So I'm going to right click on my pattern in my pattern window, and I'm going to view his properties. And we want to change his height to right around, so it completely covers this area that we just measured. So probably about 4 1/4. So it's right at 3 3 3/4. So I'm just actually going to take my aspect ratio off real quick because I don't want to make it any wider than it already is. But I'm going to take and put my height on this pattern to 4 1/4. And then we can put that aspect ratio back on and hit save. And so now that's the pattern that we want to apply this along. And this is the pattern that we want to apply to that section. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. And you'll see it kind of gets a little screwy on some of these. but it definitely gives us something that we can work with. So I'm actually going to come in here and adjust some of these pattern pieces so that it looks a little bit nicer. So the best part about this pattern is it's very user friendly because there's not a whole lot of nodes to it. So I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to actually pull some of these nodes down. And this really is not taking that long. But you can see I can actually get a fairly good result because this is a very odd shape, right? And I'm just pulling these nodes close, making sure that for the most part, the area that I want covered is covered. And for the most part, I could use what apply gives me, but don't be afraid to come in and kind of manipulate what it gives you, right? It's okay to go in and play with it. Never be afraid to play with your patterns because until you actually stitch it out, you're not wasting any thread, right? So I'm just coming in and playing with some of these patterns. Not a big deal. And then to show you how we're really going to use this, so that gives me the look I want, right? We still have that original applied pattern that we applied all those individual patterns to. We want to keep that around, but I want to go ahead and find, let's see if I can select it here. I'm going to go into my set sew order, and this time I'm going to put this first pattern here as our first selectable. So if I have a hard time selecting a pattern on the screen, sometimes I'll come into my set sew order and put the pattern that I want to select as sew order 0. So that way when I right click and exit out of there, when I click on that pattern, it's the very first pattern that I select. And I'm going to grab that pattern and I'm actually going to come down here. Let's see. This guy, I'm going to convert him so he doesn't interfere with what we're doing at the moment. I'm going to grab that guy and we're going to say our order join again. And we're just making sure all of those patterns are connected and look good. And I'm going to go ahead and combine them so that I can manipulate that as one pattern. But now the thing that looks like a boundary, we actually need to make look like a boundary. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to use my K key on the keyboard to select my first boundary. Let's convert that back to a pattern. And then we need the other half of that pattern. And you'll notice I go between boundary and pattern a lot, and it's mostly so that I can select what I need in order to get done the functionality that I need at that particular moment. So I'm going to take the pattern that we actually really want to fill, and in order to get a boundary to use with this fill, I'm actually going to convert him back to a boundary real quick because we split off that echo into 2 segments, right? Because we needed just the outside one to do our apply. So now I want to put him back together so that I can use him as a boundary. So I'm going to use my order join again to real quick make sure that bottom half and lower half of the echo are all connected. And I'm going to come in and combine those so that then I can come in, grab that echo and make him a boundary. Right? So then I can come back and take our current boundary that's highlighted, which is really the pattern we want to stitch, and go ahead and make that current boundary back, convert it back into a pattern. So now we've used that echo to create the boundary around here, right? But we've also used part of that echo to create the pattern to fill that area by using apply with it. So now I can come in to our actual pattern that we want to have stitched And I'm actually going to use fill with that to cut off all of these little tips of this pattern, just to make sure, it looks okay. And this is where I wasn't really paying attention to how closely I manipulated those tips. I just wanted to kind of make them all cut off a little bit. So now I can come in and do my fill. I'm going to do my fill inside that boundary. And it gives us a very good pattern that's perfectly shaped for this very unusual shape on this quilt. So this was the original boundary, or the original pattern that we used using draw arc with the machine head to do all of our ditch work around this shape. And then the boundary you see, that's that guy, the echoed boundary. We used echo on the inside from our stitch in the ditch shape to create this shape in the middle. And then we divided off parts of that pattern to give us the outer arc along which we applied that DV pattern, right? And then once we did the apply, we had to carefully manipulate some of the little tips on those points just to make sure they looked okay. Sometimes apply will give you some weird results, and that's okay. You can usually fix it. And then I just went ahead and made sure that that echo pattern was converted back to a boundary so we could do our fill again. So that's how I typically use apply and a couple of other features, echo and fill and those sorts of things, in order to create a custom pattern to fill a very obscure shape on this quilt. So I figured I'll just go back really quick and show you the end results. So here's a close-up of that pattern stitched out. This is while it was still on my machine. The only thing I really made sure of is when I came in and got that echo pattern, I made sure that that echo pattern came right along that white part of that fabric, because that's actually part of the fabric. So looking at some of the questions, it looks like someone's asking what stitch length and speed did I use to create the ditch work. So a lot of times when I do my ditch work, and I'm using draw arc, especially in this case, I do take my speed down. I even take it down below 2 is usually our default for ditch work when we're doing straight lines. I'm doing curves, I take my speed down to a 1. And if I'm doing tighter curves, I'll actually reduce my stitches per inch or increase my stitches per inch up to a 14 or a 16 so that I'm taking smaller bites of the fabric as I'm doing my ditch work. But in this case, it's a fairly big, gentle arcing curve. I think I probably just stuck with my default of 12 in this case. But never be afraid to go ahead and up it because it will give you a little bit more control. Let's see. And then doing the actual fill work. I typically do my fill work at about a speed of 5. And typically I'm using a stitch, stitches per inch of about 12, but occasionally I'll bump it up to 14 depending on how tightly packed that pattern is, how dense the quilting is on the quilt. But that when I move my speed down to a 5, it allows me to come in here, and when I do this fill after I put in that echo, I can make sure that all of the overstitching lines of that filled pattern go exactly over the top of that echo pattern that I've already stitched. The other thing that also gives me a better result when I'm doing that kind of precise work, I actually do have a ruler base on my Statler, and it's not because I like to use rulers. I use my ruler base on my Statler to give me a much wider space to have both hands on the quilt while that machine is quilting. And so I can do tiny little micro surfing kind of adjustments so that every time that needle takes a bite out of that quilt, it goes exactly where it needs to be. So just quick going back, here's the whole quilting that I did on that quilt. There's a lot of background quilting and that sort of thing. Again, we were addressing some of these big arched sections. And then here's, you can see all of the different components of those arched sections. Here's the finished quilt. And then here's just a close-up of that curved section. Again, I didn't need something that was really complex for that area because I wanted to let that background quilting really shine. So thanks for checking in with us. Hopefully you find this a little bit useful. And remember, we have lots of great classes from me as well as a lot of our other educators out there on gamel.com, and go to our education link and go take a look and see what other educational opportunities we have out there. We have the tour classes from last year as well as lots of other options. Thanks for tuning in with us, and we'll see you later.